That's good. Now what if I say present everyone? There you are. Okay. Okay, why don't you mute yourself, and then I'm going to mute myself right before we start.
All right.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the last day of the iOS 101 course. This is kind of a big day because you're going to finish and everything's going to kind of come together, and you're going to build an app for the homework project today that I think is the coolest one yet. But I won't give it away. The other thing I would say about tonight is it's going to be kind of hard. There's a lot to learn in this last day, and it's going to be kind of putting everything you've already learned together into one thing. So be ready to work tonight. We're actually going to have a different teacher tonight. You're going to have Spencer Curtis teaching you. He is one of our regular instructors at Lambda School. So if you decide to do the full-time course, you'll get to know him well. He's also working on our curriculum. Really solid guy that I think you'll like. But before I turn things over to him to start teaching, I wanted to kind of give my last push for the full-time course and tell you about the assessment specifically. So I mentioned a couple days ago that if you decide you want to take the full-time course, if you've completed the 101 course and learned everything that we taught here, you know the things that we think you need to know to start the full-time course. So, and I talked a little bit about the process for that, for applying at lambdaschool.com. You'll have an interview, and you're also expected to pass an assessment or a challenge, a code challenge that proves to us that you actually know some of these basic things that we want you to know before you start. So if that's something you're interested in, you can actually take the assessment anytime, even before you've scheduled an interview. I will post a link and some instructions in Slack. The assessment is two parts. It starts with some sort of small Swift code challenges where you're, writing functions and declaring variables and creating arrays and solving little problems, kind of one at a time. And that's sort of the first half of the course, or the assessment. The second half is actually building an Xcode project, an iOS app that's fairly similar to what you're gonna learn tonight and actually build for the homework tonight. The idea is we just want to make sure that you actually absorb the stuff you learned. So if that's something you're interested in, if the full-time course is something you're thinking about, go ahead and take the assessment whenever you'd like. You could take it tomorrow if you wanted. And I'd love to see as many of you as want to join us in the full-time course. There's the interview part, so I'm not guaranteeing a spot, but I think it's a really great way to learn iOS. If you've enjoyed the last 2 weeks and you think this programming thing is for you, come learn a lot more about it and get a job doing it. I certainly have liked being a programmer for my career. So with that out of the way, I'm going to turn things over to Spencer, and he's going to tell you about table views and navigation and some some really important stuff when you're for building the kinds of iOS apps you're used to using. So, Spencer, let me make sure I can get you up on screen. All right, it's all yours.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so like Andrew said, we'll be talking about table views today. And if you've used an iOS app before, you've seen a table view. There's basically no application, maybe besides a game, that doesn't use a table view. They're just so common. And so it's a really integral part of iOS development. So let me share my screen real quick, and we'll get started. Okay. So let's jump into Xcode. And when the window pops up, sorry, let me do that again. When the window pops up here, or you can now hit a new Xcode project. We're not going to be working in a playground anymore. We'll be using a project. And the Xcode project is, when you want to make a full application, this is what you'll use. You can also go to File, New, Project, and it will pull that up. And just like playgrounds, there are actually a couple options that we can choose from that sort of are templates to help you start out. And to be completely honest, I've really only used single view applications. It's not that hard to get to where you need to be, from a single view application to, one of these templates. So I just generally use a single view app. And then from here, we can, choose any name we want to. So the application we're going to be making today is the Contacts app again, but it's going to be a little bit different. So I'll call this Contacts. Feel free to call it whatever you want. Don't worry about the team, and you can choose an organization name. Like when I'm just doing my own personal stuff, I'll just make this say Spencer Curtis. And the organization identifier would be then com.spencercurtis. And then it will place the name of your project at the end of there. Make sure you choose Swift. Obviously, we're not learning Objective-C yet. And then if you have these boxes checked, you can just uncheck them. We don't need those. And you guys have done this before, I'm sure. I'm just trying to review here. So go ahead and create this project wherever you want, and we'll get started. Give me 1 second here. Cool. So we're going to make the Contacts project again, but it's going to be a little different. Like I said, instead this time we're going to have it be using a table view, so we can actually have a list of all of these contacts, and then go to sort of a detail view. Actually, why don't I just share the oh, that's weird. Hold on just a second. Sorry, guys, my simulators aren't showing up for some reason. Let me try to put it on my phone here. Sorry for the technical difficulties, guys. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So what we have is a basic application, and this is the table view that I was talking about. It's just a list of items, basically, that, in this case, represent a contact. And so what we're going to be able to do is tap on one of these contacts, and it will take us to a detailed view. So if I tap on Chris, for example, here, it's actually going to kind of slide over into a new view that says name Chris. And that's all we're going to do. It's very basic, but we'll be able to, get the basics of table views now. Okay, so now that you've seen that, let me pull up the project again. Okay, perfect. So we're going to start in the storyboard, and generally the way that I like to build out projects is I will start with the storyboard. That helps me know, basically the layout of my app and sort of what I need to create. And sometimes maybe you don't know everything you need to do, but it's a good place to start and just kind of hash out your ideas and sort of almost like prototype the app without writing any code. So for us, if we wanted it to look like the example I showed, we're not going to need this view controller. So you can either select the view controller here, and if you guys are using Xcode 10, it may look a little bit different. I'm still on Xcode 9. So if you click here or you click over here and hit the delete key, that should go away. And what we're going to do instead is actually use one of these table view controllers over here. And this will have a table view sort of pre-configured inside of it. You could also just put a table view in a view controller. However, this has, first of all, it's easier, which is just why we're going to do it. And generally, if you just want to show a table view that takes up the entire screen, this is the way to go. It's just very simple. And then we're also going to need one more view controller that's just a normal UI view controller as that detail view that you guys saw. And so this is our basic interface here. But the question is now, how do we navigate from one view controller to another? Well, the way that we do that is by using a segue. And these segues are basically a way to navigate from one view controller to another. And they're connected from some sort of UI element that you can interact with. So say I want to go to the detail view when I push a button or tap on this cell. You'll make the segue from that cell, and then it will let you go to whatever view controller you connect that segue to. The way that you do that is very similar to the way that you set up outlets or actions. So you can just click on the cell here, and sometimes you might actually, so over here you see that I have selected the cell. Sometimes you'll accidentally click on this content view and it won't quite work. So be aware of that. I always just like to have this sort of visual hierarchy over here, just so I can know I've selected the right thing. Okay, so I'm going to select the table view cell, and you can either control and drag from over here or the actual cell itself, just making sure that you are selecting the right thing, and drag over to the second view controller and let go. And it'll pull up this contextual menu, and it'll give you a bunch of these options. We're not really going to talk about any of these options. What we're going to need is just this show segue. And you might be, I guess, you might be thinking, oh, I want to show the detail view, but show detail is a little bit different. It has to do with navigation with iPads. So you don't need to worry about that. It's not actually what you might think. We're just going to do show. And the show segue is like I showed in the example. It's that right to left transition that the view controller kind of just slides over from the right and sort of replaces what's on the screen there. That's like the most basic segue. Most of the time, that's the kind of segue you'll be doing. And I'm sure you can see that just from any app you use. That's generally the kind of segue that that is used. I guess it's worth mentioning, we're not going to use it now, but you could also use a present modally segue. That's another one that is sometimes commonly used. And that is if you've ever seen like a view controller kind of bounce up from the bottom, it doesn't go from right to left. It actually goes from the bottom to the top of the screen. And there are a couple of reasons we don't want to do that that I'll mention in a few minutes. But yeah, so for now, we'll just do show. So we're going to run into a problem, though, which is if we were to run this and we actually had cells that we could select, it would transition over to this view controller. But then once we get to that point, we'd actually be stuck, and there would be no way to go back to this table view, for example, to look at a different contact or whatever. And so it gets replaced with this, and we can never go back without doing a little bit of work. But the user won't be able to go back by default. So the way that we solve this problem is by adding what's called a navigation controller. So we're going to add that, and then I'll sort of explain what that does. So what we're going to do is we're going to, well, we want this table view to sort of be like our base view controller, or the very first view controller that the user sees. So we would generally, hit this is initial view controller. So the application will start at that view controller when we launch the app. However, we need this navigation controller to sort of control the navigation. Hence the word or the name navigation controller. We want it to control the navigation of these view controllers, and so we're going to hit editor up here in the menu bar, embed in navigation controller. And if you do that when the table view controller is selected up here, it's actually going to sort of chuck on this navigation controller scene here in front of the table view controller. So basically the rule is, whatever view controller you want to be sort of the root or the base or first view controller, that's what you embed in in a navigation controller. And you may notice these view controllers actually change. So let me get that away here. So you notice prototype cells is basically up to the status bar, and this is completely blank. But when I add the navigation controller, it adds this gray bar here and this gray bar here with a back button. So this is the reason that we use navigation controllers, is because it actually will manage the navigation between all of these view controllers for you, and you don't really have to do any work for it, which is really nice. You just automatically get these nice back buttons and this this navigation bar that people are used to seeing. As of iOS 10 or 11, I'm not quite sure. You may have seen like those navigation bars that are a little chunkier with like the chunky letters. It's very simple to add those. So here, let's do this. If you click on the navigation controller, or sorry, this navigation bar above the table view, in the attributes inspector over here, we can change all, some of its properties, and we'll just change the title to contacts. So the user knows sort of, what this list is going to have in it. If we wanted, we could make this sort of that different looking navigation controller by, different looking navigation bar by clicking on this navigation controller, clicking on its navigation bar, and you say prefers large titles. And that's all you need to do to make it look a little more updated, I guess. It's not necessary to do that. You can absolutely use a normal navigation bar. However, this is kind of, to me, it looks a little bit better. So yeah, like I said, we get this back button for free, which is awesome. It'll let us go into a contact, and then the user can hit the back button, and it'll kick them back to this table view so they can look at other contacts as well. Are there any questions so far, or are you guys good? Okay, no one's typing on Slack, so I'm assuming you guys are good. Okay, so we're going to move on. There are a couple things we need to do, a couple more things we need to do in the storyboard. The first would be to set up our cell. How do we want the cell to look? Well, we have a few options. Like I said, table views are used in pretty much every app, and Apple kind of recognizes that, and it's given us a few basic cell styles, they call them, that, if you just want to set up a table view super quick and you don't necessarily need it to look super fancy or anything, you just need it to be very basic or whatever, you can use some of these cell styles, and basically you end up doing a little bit less work than you would if you were to make your own custom cell. So we'll just go down the line here in case you haven't seen these. Basic just adds a single label over on the cell. Right detail will add a label over to the right as well, keeping that first one. Left detail will, it kind of smushes them together. I think the actual Apple Contacts app uses this, maybe. It's not one that I personally use a ton, but it's there. And another nice one is the subtitle. And you can actually make these cells as big as you want them to be. You kind of get that for free with these basic cells. But all we're going to do is show the title, and that's it. It's just, this is just going to be very simple. We just want to show the contact's name, and that's plenty for us. Cells also have identifiers, and so we'll sort of see why we need to do this in a second. But basically, you could have, don't do this right now. I'm just doing this to show you. You can actually have multiple kinds of cells in one in one table view controller, and so basically, there's a place that asks, okay, how do you want this cell to look, or what do you want this cell, what information do you want to have in this cell, and it needs to know where, basically which cell we're talking about, even if we only have one cell. So the way that we do this is you, again, click on the cell here, making sure that the cell is selected, not the content view. And in the attributes inspector, this reuse identifier right here will let us sort of identify, the cell that we're talking about in our code. So I'll just call this, basically this can be whatever string you want it to be. I just generally like to say what kind of cell, what information, I guess, is being displayed in the cell. So I'm just going to call this contact cell. And that's it. So we'll sort of touch on that in a few minutes, but know that we need to do that. The last thing we need to do in here is actually add, we need to do two more things. We need to add, a place where we can show the name of our contact when we go to this detail view. So I'm just going to, in the object library, look for a label. Make this just super easy. We're going to actually have two labels. This one will just be, we'll just say name. Serena, you said my navigation controller doesn't have an arrow pointing to it. Are you talking about this one? If you are, this is the segue. It doesn't come for free. So let me delete mine. So that arrow is the segue saying, okay, we're able to navigate from this table view controller to this UI view controller. Basically, it's making a connection between these view controllers. Oh, I see. The leftmost one. This one right here. Did you embed your navigation controller in did you embed your table view controller in the navigation controller? Oh, the arrow on the left. Wow, I am so sorry. Okay, all you have to do for that one is click on the navigation controller up here. in the attributes inspector, just click is initial view controller. I'm so sorry. I chose every other arrow except for the one you were talking about. Okay, I'm going to move on. I assume that's what you were talking about for real this time. Okay, cool. So we're going to drag out one more label here that will actually display the name of the contact right there. So I'm just going to select these both and say add missing constraints. That's good enough for now. You know, I think you guys know how to put things in a label. That's not necessarily the point of this project. Okay, the last final thing we need to do is just like cells, you know, there can be multiple cells in a table view. There can also be multiple segues going from this view controller. You know, say we want to, you know, let's see. You know, we also may want to have a view controller down here that we navigate to, you know, from a button or something. Segues also have identifiers. Sorry, let me get rid of that. That wasn't actually what we needed. So basically, this identifier is going to let us in code know which segue we are using. And what I'm just going to say is, again, you just kind of call the segue something that makes sense. So I'm just going to say contact detail. Lakana said, totally lost. How can I help you? What are you lost on? Am I just going too fast? Because I'm definitely okay to slow down if you guys need. Okay, I'll let you respond. I'm going to move on until I see a response, and then I'll address that. Jeffrey said, I've seen segues named in uppercase and sometimes in camel case. Is there best practices guideline? I would probably say no, not really. It's sort of a personal preference thing. I think the more common thing and the thing that we will sort of be going by is to have segue identifiers and also cell identifiers for that matter be upper camel case, so like this. But no, it doesn't make a difference. I would say the best practices really kind of just depends where you learned it, I guess. Okay, cool. So we'll move on. So this view controller.swift that it comes with is actually not really useful to us because we deleted that view controller scene that it came with, you know, when we started in the storyboard, and so they're not really connected anymore. And I'll talk about that in just a sec. So I'm actually just going to go to this view controller.swift file and delete it. We don't need that. And you can say remove reference or move to trash. I just generally move it to the trash. But we need to make view controller files for both of these view controllers, for this table view controller and this detail view controller, so that we can interact with them in our code. Otherwise, there's basically no way we can say, you know, this is what I want to have in my cell, and this is what I want this label to say. The way that we do that is by going to File, New File, or hitting Command-N. And there are a bunch of files you can choose from. The two most common ones that you'll ever use are this Swift file and this Cocoa Touch class. So this Cocoa Touch class, if we hit next on it, excuse me, will let us basically make a view controller file or whatever kind of file we want. And it'll come with some code for free that, you know, like here, but we'll do the detail view controller first. So the best practice here is definitely to name this class, you know, in a descriptive manner. So for example, this detail view controller over here, maybe the best thing to call it would be like contact detail view controller, just so you know, okay, so this is probably going to show some information about the contact, and it's a detail view from this table view. And I would say, you know, name the file whatever makes sense to you. There's no absolute naming convention. However, it should just be descriptive enough so that you could, you know, look at the file name on the left here and say, oh, okay, I know more or less what this view controller is about. So we'll call it contact detail view controller. If this also create zip file is checked, you can uncheck that. Make sure it's a subclass of UI view controller, and the language is Swift. The reason I know that it should be a subclass of UI view controller is because we just dragged out in the object library a view controller object, and we'll see the difference with this table view controller in a second. So just hit next. If this group is on this blue file, it's not really a big deal, but I'll just generally put it in this folder here. And you should see over here, now we have this contact detail view controller. So like I said, this comes with some code for free. I think that it's worth mentioning, when you make a Cocoa Touch file, there is really no difference. I mean, it is a Swift file. There's not really much of a difference between this Cocoa Touch file and the Swift file, other than it comes with some code for free, so you don't have to write it out. However, sometimes you don't need all of this code, and it's kind of, you know, it's just boilerplate code, and sometimes you end up deleting a lot more than you need, which is what we'll do with the table view controller. So if that bugs you, you know, you could just make a normal Swift file and fill everything out from, you know, from scratch. Basically, I'm saying it's up to you. Okay, so then let's make another file, another Cocoa Touch file. This time, choose subclass of UI table view controller. And the reason I know that is because when we, you know, dragged out this table view controller, it is a table view controller. So if we had a collection view controller, we would make a subclass of UI collection view controller, or whatever you want it to be. That way, basically, you know, the interaction between the code and the storyboard matches up, and they're actually able to say, oh yeah, I can basically, you know, be the code version of this view controller in the storyboard. So when you say subclass of table view controller, it'll automatically fill out with this, which is really nice. So I'm just going to call this contact list table view controller. And again, hit create, and you know, you can check the group if you want. Okay. So this time, if you scroll through this, we have a lot of boilerplate code, and we're definitely not going to talk about all of this. However, we'll talk about some of it. So one thing you may not have seen before, and I don't think you've seen it before, maybe, I think you've been using just the default view controller up to now, is we actually need to link up these view controller files with the view controller's scenes that are on the storyboard, basically, so that it knows, you know, when someone taps on this cell or whatever, it knows what code file to look for to know, you know, what to do in that situation, or even to know, you know, what information needs to be put on these cells or whatever. So the way that we do this is if you click on the yellow circle on the view controller again, we're on the table view controller right now, or you can do it over here as well. Over here on this like little card, like almost like a driver's license card looking thing called the identity inspector, click on that, and it'll say custom class here. Right here is where we're actually able to say, okay, I want you to be connected to this specific Swift file. And so if you just start typing contact list, it should fill itself in, because it knows that contact list table view controller is a CocoaTouch file subclass of UI table view controller. And so it's, it knows basically it's able to be the code file for this scene. Like if we started typing contact detail, it wouldn't even let us because it knows this isn't a view controller scene, this is a table view controller scene, which is kind of nice. And then just hit enter, and that will sort of connect the two so that they know that they can interact with each other. Okay, and we'll do the same thing for this contact detail view. So just click on this circle here. Sorry if I'm going too fast, let me know. And also feel free to just ask questions whenever you guys want. And then we'll just say contact detail view controller, and it'll automatically fill out to that. Hit enter. That will connect the two, and that lets us actually, set these up, which is awesome. So while we're here, we don't actually need to make any outlets on this table view controller. However, we will need to make an outlet for this label so that we can change the name to whatever the context name is. So let's open up the assistant editor by either clicking on this show assistant editor button, or I like to just hold Option and click on the view controller that I want to open. And I will just open it to the side here. Okay, and then what we're going to do is drag an outlet to this label. I'm going to put it at the bottom, and we'll just call this contact name label. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about this table view controller first of all. Let's jump into the contact list table view controller file. And you might be overwhelmed with all of the code that's here, and that's okay. We're actually going to sort of trim this down and only keep what we absolutely need. So to start off with, we don't need this did receive memory warning function. It's the second function here, so you can delete that. Then we're going to keep this number of sections in table view function. We'll keep the next one called table view number of rows in section. And then we're going to uncomment this multi-line comment here, this right under the number of rows in section. Make sure that you get both this top comment and this bottom comment here. And that will uncomment the function called cell for row at IndexPath. And then after that, you can select everything but the very last function, right where it says mark navigation. So you should have selected, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 functions. And if this is confusing to you, you can leave these things. It's not going to hurt anything to have them there. It's just, I understand that, having it all cluttered like this can be kind of a lot to take in. So we should be left with, oh, sorry, and then I'm just going to comment out or uncomment this last function here called prepare for segue. So we should be left with, actually, I don't even think we need this viewDid load function either. No, we don't. So I'll delete that as well. Okay, so we should be left with number of sections in table view, number of rows in section, cell for row at index path, and prepare for segue. I'll give you guys just 1 second to catch up, and then we'll continue. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, you guys are quiet today. All right. So let's talk about these functions. There are sort of two groups of functions. First, we have this table view data source, which is these three functions. And then we have this prepare for segue, which is dealing with the segue. Latana asks, how do you know what to uncomment? Practice, I guess. Just having done this a ton. The best part about these table view controllers is, like I said, they're used in every app. And so you will get so much practice with filling out these table view controllers that it's sort of just like becomes second nature to know what to delete and what not to delete based on what you want to do with these table view controllers. Like one of the functions was to allow swipe to delete feature. So if you wanted that, you would keep that function. It's just kind of like practice. However, I'm going to touch on that in just 1 second here, but that's a great question. So these three table view data source functions, they're called, are sort of the basic functions that you need in order to set up a table view. Whoops. However, actually, this number of sections in table view, you don't actually need it. I'll talk about why. So we have sort of this interaction and sort of like a conversation between these two elements, which are the table view controller and the table view. And there's a distinction there that we'll kind of talk about a little bit more. Well, we'll talk about a lot more in the full iOS course. However, the table view controller isn't actually what's being displayed on the screen. The table view is. And so the table view controller, its job is to sort of manage the table view behind the scenes. And that's obviously this code file. But what the user actually sees is just the table view. And so this goes into this concept of MVC, or model view controller. And it's a very large and broad topic, so we're not going to really get into it a ton today. However, I just want to say MVC is basically a way that a design pattern, or a way that we structure our code so that our code is both clean and so we're not putting, for example, all of our code in one file. That would just be a pain to have thousands of lines of code on the same code file. And also it helps us be able to keep our code so clean and also reusable and sort of scalable, in the sense that it's expandable, where you can add many things to it or remove things from it, and you don't end up breaking your entire app when you do that and have to refactor, fix all of your code later. But basically, sorry, that was kind of a tangent. But basically, we have this conversation going on between the table view controller and the table view. And through these three functions, the table view is sort of requesting some information from the table view controller. It's saying, I don't have this information. I don't have the information of how many sections I need in my table view. I don't have the information of how many cells I need in the table view. And I don't know, this function is basically what we want to display in the table view. So let me actually write that out. Feel free to comment this out as well. This is just notes for you guys. It's not anything you need. So this asks how many sections there in the table view. This is how many cells should be in each section. The self-read index path, even though it doesn't really necessarily explicitly say it quite as well as these two functions, this is what information should be displayed. So, and that's sort of the very basis. The very base of setting up a table view. So we just simply return a number that we want. So basically, the table view is asking us, how many sections do you want me to have? And you return a number here. So for us, we're just going to want one section. Sections, if you're not familiar with them, are just like sort of the groups of cells. And then, in between each section, there's generally like a little line that says, whatever, some title like the contacts app, the real iOS contacts app has, I think, still has one in between, the A context and the B context, and they're sort of separated into sections like that. However, for us, we'll just want one. So you can either keep this function and keep it as one, or we can actually delete this function as well, and the table view will automatically assume that we want one section. If that's confusing to you, you're welcome to keep it here, but I'm just saying we don't actually need this here. This isn't a required function. However, the number of rows in section function and the self-row index function are absolutely required in order to set up a table view. So going back to Latana's question, how do you know what to uncomment? Well, if you want to set up a table view, at the very, very absolute minimum, these are the two functions you need. That's it. Other than that, the rest is just sort of like if you want to do more things like set up swipe to delete, or if you want multiple sections or things like that. But at the very minimum, table view controllers need these two functions, and that's it. So I'll leave this here, but know that you can delete this as well. So number of rows in section. Let's talk about this. This will go through and say, okay, for each section I have, how many cells do you want me to sort of set up inside of it? And for us, what we're going to want to do is have one cell for every contact that we have. So let's actually set up our sort of array of contacts so we can have the information that we want to display. I'm just going to do this at the bottom here. Let me pull this up. So for this is going to be super simple. We're not going to make a structure class like we talked about yesterday. We'll just say the contacts equal, and then we're just going to make an array of strings. This is just going to be very, very simple. And just go ahead and make a few people. Okay. So I made some contacts. So how, and I want someone to answer here. How could I tell this function? So if I need to return just an int, a number, how could I tell this function to return the amount of contacts that I have in this array? Right now I have 4, but I don't want to go in and change it here and then also change it here. So how could I just say, take the amount of contacts that I have in this array? Yeah, perfect. .count. .count is going to be awesome. Yeah, contacts.count. Thank you, Jesse. So we're just going to access the array to begin with. I call it contacts, and then we're going to say .count. So this is just a property on that array tab, which is awesome. That lets us just say, okay, we have this array. Just take the count of right here where it says the number of elements in the collection, and give me that number. And it's very easy and very useful, especially when we're setting up table views. So now it knows, okay, if there are 4 things in this array, I'll give you 4 cells. This is perfect because you always want the information that you want to display in the table view and the amount of cells that you want to display in the table view match up, if that makes sense. So if I have 4 contacts, obviously I want 4 cells. If I have 1 less, then I'm not going to show all the information. If I have 1 more, I don't have enough information to display on the table view. Okay, so that's perfect. So now we've said, sweet, we want 4 cells for now. And then what happens is the table view will then jump down to this self-row at IndexPath function and say, what do you want me to display on this cell? So basically, it doesn't quite actually work like this in reality, but an easy way to look at this for now is to think that the table view is going to call this function in a for loop, essentially saying, okay, so if there are 4 contacts here, it's going to call this function 4 times, once for every cell, and say, for this first cell, what do you want me to display? Okay, got it. For the second cell, what do you want me to display? And so on until it's gone through the amount of cells that it needs to set up. In a nutshell, that's sort of how it works. In reality, it's a little bit different, but that's great for now. So we get this a couple lines for free. This let cell. Let's talk about this. So to begin with, sorry, let me back up just a little bit more. This function cell for row at index path gives us a couple things. It gives us the table view that we are setting up. It gives us the index path, which we're trying to set up, which I'll talk about in just a second. And it wants us to return a table view cell. So at the very end, it's saying, all right, you need to make a cell and return it to me that, with all of the information that you want to display. This index path is simply two things. It's actually, let me just pull it up. It's the section of the table view and the row, or the essentially, yeah, the row or the cell. So we have section. So this index path knows, what section it's in and what row it is. So for example, the very first time this runs, the index path section would be 0, just like, basically table view has an array of sections and an array of rows. And so since they're arrays, they start at 0. So the index path dot section, the very first time this runs is going to be 0. We're on section 0. And then the index path dot row is going to be 0 as well, because we want to set up the very first cell. The next time this runs, the index path dot section is going to be 0 again. We're still in the very first section. However, the index path dot row is going to be 1 this time, and so on. And it'll work through that until it's basically filled out. It's asked for all the information for every cell. So, if we had 2 sections here, it would do that for all 4 contexts, and then it would go section 1, index path 0, and fill itself out again. So basically, like this comment says, we need to tell it what information that should be displayed in each cell. So this line right here is calling this dkey reusable cell with identifier. If you remember, we set up a cell identifier in our storyboard to say, this is the cell that I'm talking about. I want you to make this kind of cell. So let's go back. Generally, I'll forget what I named the cell. So I'll just go over to my storyboard here, click on the cell, and in the attributes inspector, I called it contact cell. This identifier has to be exactly matching whatever is in here in the storyboard. So I just like to double click this and copy it, or just select it like that and copy, and go back to my contact list table view controller. And then I can just drop this identifier where it says reuse identifier. This is sort of just like a placeholder. If you were to run the app right now and have it set up the cells, it would actually crash, because it would say, hey, there's not actually a reuse identifier with the name reuse identifier, right? So I'm just going to paste that in here, and then it's going to say, okay, table view, I want you to grab a cell called contact cell, and it will know, oh, okay, sweet, you're going to make this kind of cell. So this is where, if we had multiple cells, this is how you differentiate the kind of cell that you want to create in code. And it knows, okay, sweet, it's a basic cell. So now we need to know what information to put in the cell. And all we're going to do is grab one of these contacts. The way that we do this is, again, so the source of data for our table view, which is this array of contacts, and the table view itself work really well together. There's sort of the synergy going where, obviously, if we are on the first cell here, or the cell at index path.row 0, we want to grab the very first contact, or at index 0. So we can very easily get this contact for Sam from this index path here. So can anyone remind me how? So if I just, for example, wanted to get like the third person in my array of contacts. So if I said let contact equal contacts, how do I like get the third person? Yeah, perfect. We're going to use subscript syntax, so the brackets, and we're going to say 2 since array start at 0, right? And that would give us, George. So we should, well, yeah, let's do that. So then we'll say cell dot text label dot text. So this is the this label right here. It's just referred to as text label. It just comes with the cell for free. You don't have to make an outlet or anything. Equals contact. And then at the very end, it's going to return that cell back to the table view, and then the table view will actually put the cell on the table view. We should actually be able to run this right now, and we'll see what happens. It's not going to be quite what we want, so just know that, and then we'll fix it. Okay, so we've got our contacts list, and we have 4 Georges. So that's obviously not quite what we want. Yep, exactly, Jeffrey. So that's not quite what we want. But however, we did, get 4 cells on the screen, and we have 1 section. So the number of sections in table view is working as it should be, and so is the number of rows in section. However, we want to display every contact we have in the array, not just one of them, right? And so that's where this interaction or this close relationship with the index path and our array comes in. So instead of putting 2 there all the time in the subscript, we can actually say, okay, so if we're on the first time that this runs, we would be at IndexPath.section 0 and IndexPath.row 0, and we would want to display the first contact in the array, whose index is also 0. So what we can use is the IndexPath.row here, and it will actually let us, the first time that this runs, it'll be 0 here. The second time, it'll be 1, and so on. So now if we run it, just by changing that one thing, we will actually have our contacts list show everyone. Okay, I know we're getting close to out of time. This is probably this is going to go over 7. I apologize. But this is the last one. I want to make sure that we, hit on everything really well. I'll try not to go super over time, but okay. So just to recap super quick. Oh, okay. Boomer asked, where's IndexPath.row coming from? I see that index path, but what about the row part? Yeah, that's a great question. So these 2 parameters, we have the table view, which it's a table view. It has a bunch of different properties. We also have the index path, which also has a bunch of different properties. So if we look in the documentation here, we can see index path, the struct index path has all of these different properties and functions added onto it. And so this index path, like I said, basically the 2 parts you need to know are that the 2 properties that you'll really use the most are that it has a row and a section. So it knows which section it's in and also which row. Okay, good, that makes more sense. Awesome. So yeah, and if we had multiple sections, it would get a little bit more complicated than that. But honestly, for 95% of all the table views I've ever made, they just have 1 section. There's not a ton of times where you'll need multiple sections, at least from my experience. However, this is enough to get you by for a while, and we'll do sections in the full course. Okay. So we need to do one last thing, which is if we go into the simulator again, we click on Sarah, it just shows name label. We should have this say Sarah here. So we need to pass some information from the cell over to this detail view. And the way that we do that is using this prepare for segue function. This is going to get called, or this code inside of this function is going to get run as soon as I tap on this cell. Sorry, I'm going to slow down the animation and just to sort of illustrate the point. So as I tap on the cell, it's going to start segueing over. And as it does, it's going to call this prepare for segue function. And basically right before it starts that transition, and it will let us pass over any data we want to, so that by the time this view shows up, it'll have enough information to fill itself out and not, have just like this placeholder text. I'm going to turn that off. Okay, so we need to go to the contact detail view controller real quick and do one thing. So, oh, no, yeah, we do. Sorry. Okay, I'm also going to delete the did receive memory warning and the prepare for segue commented out here. We don't need either of those. We will need the beta though in just a sec. Okay, so I'm going to make a variable called contact. And it's just going to be a string optional. What this is going to be is basically a placeholder, or think of it as almost like a mailbox that the table view controller can put, if I tap on Sarah, we're going to pass this contact, Sarah, over to this variable here, and then let the detail view controller grab that contact and then put it in the contact name label. It's not good practice to, for example, try to change the name label directly from a different view controller. That kind of breaks that MVC that I know we haven't really talked about and may not make sense why, but it's just not good practice to do that. And actually, most of the time it would crash even if you tried. So we're going to use this prepare for segue function. It gives us a couple hints here. So we'll leave those there for just a second. But what we're going to do first is, like I said, let me pull up this storyboard. Like I said, our view controllers can have segues to multiple different view controllers. Maybe we want to go from the cell to this view controller, but we add a button that goes to a different view controller. What we want to do based on the segue is completely dependent on the segue itself and where we're going. And so that's why we made this segue identifier to let us know, okay, when they tap on the cell here, it's going to know, okay, I'm a contact detail segue, and we're able to find that out in this function to say, okay, if we're using the contact detail segue right now, do this, run this code and configure it so that it passes the information to the view controller. If it's another segue, do something else. And obviously we only have one, and so it's not necessarily absolutely necessary. However, it's good practice anyway, and it lets you be prepared if for whatever reason you do want to add a view controller later on. So again, just like with the cell, so if you click on the arrow in between the two view controllers, copy this identifier again, because this needs to be exact just like the cell identifier. In the prepare for segue, what we're going to do is say if segue dot identifier is equal to contact detail. I'll open up these brackets. Then we know, okay, if the segue that's happening right now is the contact detail, then we can do something specific for that. Otherwise, we could add an else statement and do something else. So let's look at these hints that it gives us. It says, get the new view controller using segue.destination view controller, pass the selected object to the new view controller. Basically what we're saying is we need kind of two pieces of information in order to pass Sarah over to this detail view controller. One is the destination view controller, or this view controller itself. We need to grab it in code so we can place the contact there, and we also need the contact itself to be able to pass over. So let's do that. I'm actually going to, no, that's fine. So it says get the new view controller using segue.destination view controller. Well, that's simple enough. I'll just say call this whatever whatever you want. I'll call this contact detail VC just for view controller equals segue dot destination. Now we have access to the segue because it's one of the parameters in this prepare for segue function. So the segue knows a few things. It knows its identifier. It also knows where it's going and where it came from. Obviously, where it came from is this view controller, so we don't really need that. But this is going to be the contact detail view controller. Okay, the selected object is basically just whatever we tap on here. So how could I get Sarah from this array? Well, it's not quite as simple as it is in the self-read index path. Basically, it's not simple because we don't have access to an index path by default. So I can never say, let contact equal contacts, the array, and say index path dot row. That doesn't actually exist, and so it's going to yell at me and say, hey, there's nothing called index path. But what we can do is get an index path. So the way that we do that is we ask the table view, okay, hey, what was the last cell that was selected? So again, since this just works out to perfect timing, and it's so genius the way that it's set up. The prepare for segue gets called as soon as I tap on the cell, and as it's transitioning, it's going to call this, and then we can ask the table view, hey, what was the cell that was just tapped on? Can you give me its index path so I can use that to get the contact? So we're going to say let index path equal table view, and then we're going to ask it, okay, what is the index path for selected row? And that will say, okay, they just tapped on index path section 0, row 1, which is the second cell. The problem is this index path is optional, so we'll need to unwrap it. I know optionals are probably confusing for you guys, but I promise they'll make more sense as you get some practice with them. I'm just going to use a guardlet statement to unwrap this super quick. I'm just going to say guardlet index path equals table view index path for selected row, else return. And then it'll stop yelling at me and say, sweet, I got a contact. I have all the information I need. So if they tap on the second cell, this will be index path.row 1. Now all we need to do is pass the contact over to this contact detail VC, and that's why we have this contact property to sort of act as the mailbox or the place that we deposit that contact into. But we're going to run into a problem, which is that contact detail VC won't actually let me access that contact. The reason is if we option click on contact detail VC up here, it says it's a UI view controller, which is true. However, it's actually a more specific kind of view controller, right? We talked about subclasses and inheritance yesterday. Our contact detail view controller is inheriting from UI view controller, but it's actually a more specific kind of view controller called a contact detail view controller, and it has extra properties that a normal UI view controller doesn't have, like this contact name label and this contact property. And so we basically need to tell the compiler and say, hey, I know this is a UI view controller, but it's actually this more specific kind of view controller. And so we kind of one-up it and say, I'm smarter than you, make it be this kind of view controller. And the way that we do that is with typecasting. And so the way that you do that is we're going to say as question mark contact detail view controller. And that's basically us, again, saying, hey, this is a view controller, but it's this specific kind of view controller. We'll go into that a little bit more in the actual course, but basically that's really all you need to know for now. Okay, so now if I try to say contact detail vc.contact, it'll actually show up and say, okay, sweet. I know that this contact property exists because it's a contact detail view controller. So then we can say equals our contact that we just got right here. That will successfully pass the whatever contact we tap on over to the detail view controller. Now, if we were to run this right now, it actually wouldn't show up at all because there's The view controller has that information. However, it hasn't ever told the label, hey, this is the contact that you need to show. So the last thing that we'll do is we'll go to the contact detail view controller and do that. We're going to make a function for this, and this is a very common pattern that during the full course that you'll use all the time for setting up detail views. There's nothing special about this function inherently. It's just sort of a pattern that we use. So we're going to make a function called update views. And the job of this function, like it says, is just to update the views with whatever information you want. And for this, in this scenario, all we need to do is say, okay, this label needs to show the contact that was just passed over. So all we're going to say is contact name label dot text equals our contact. So we've written this function. We actually need to call it in order for it to do anything. So we're going to call it in the view.load. And I know, well, I'm super out of time, but let's look at this, and this should run. And then I want to talk about one last thing before I let you guys loose. So once you've got that, hit the run button or Command R, or just watch mine, either way. And then, so if I tap on Sarah, now it should say name Sarah. And I can go back thanks to our navigation controller and go into Lori or Sam or George or whatever, and it will replace the text of that label with the actual name of the contact. So that's the app in a nutshell. I hope you guys liked it. This, like I said, I know I went quick and I apologize. There was a lot to cover. However, during the course, you guys will feel 1000% comfortable with what we just did, because every app that we use basically is going to do something similar to this. You can pass more than one value via segue correct. Yes, you can. So for, maybe, I mean, it doesn't really make sense, but maybe we also had like a phone number here. And this is like not something you would actually do in a real app generally, because you would actually make like a contact object, like a struct or a class that you would just pass, that contact class, and then that would have all the properties. However, yes, it is possible to pass more than one value via segue. If you want. I think that's basically it. Oh, the last thing I wanted to show you guys was these things called property observers. These are really nice because maybe in this detail view, we also allow them to edit their contact or whatever. We would want to, after they've edited the contact, for this label to change as well. And so we would want to call this update views function again. What we can do is add a property observer that lets us basically say anytime that the value of contact is changed or set, run some sort of code. And so what we're going to do is tell it to call the update views function. So we're going to add braces like this, and it looks kind of weird. This isn't necessarily syntax that you would probably be familiar with, but that's okay. And then we're going to use the did set keyword, and it should highlight itself in pink. And then basically what this will say is anything inside of these brackets will run every time that the contact string is set. So if I change this to, or if this is Sarah, when we come in, that's great, and it'll call the update views function for us. And then if I edit it so that it says Sarah Curtis or whatever, it will update, and basically anytime I change the value of this contact, it will also call the did set, and so then it would update the label for us. So we're going to say update views. There is a problem with this, however. If we were to run this right now, it would actually crash our app. The reason is, sorry, this actually is kind of a longer conversation topic, but basically, as we're segueing, just because the order of events happening. When we tap on this, there isn't actually enough time for this view controller to load the name label before it tries to set the name label, and so it crashes because this is an implicitly unwrapped optional. If that didn't make sense, that's okay. You don't really need to worry about it. The thing that we need to do to fix it is to write a guard statement to make sure that the views have loaded, had enough time to load before we actually try to set something inside of them, like the contact inside of the label. So we're going to say guard is view loaded, else return. And that's just going to sort of block this from breaking as soon as we segue. However, it's very useful if while we're in that detail view controller, we change the contact. So it's nice to have the update views here and here as well. And if that went over your head, that's kind of extra. You don't necessarily need to know that super well, but now it'll work. Okay, guys, let me grab. Perfect. Okay. Are there any last questions before we go into the project? I know that was probably a lot, and I apologize. Okay, cool. I'm going to put your homework in the iOS June 11 Slack channel, and just go ahead and get started on that. I'm sorry to the PMs that I sort of messed up the schedule, and I'm sorry to you guys as well. So this is just it's called Swift Vocabulary. This is really cool. It's basically what we just did. However, it's going to, it's a table view that has a list of vocabulary in Swift, and then if you tap on the detail, it will show the definition. So it's basically what you did, just with different data. And then the best thing that I can tell you guys is that repetition is key. As much as like no one wants to hear that answer, it's going to be the best thing for you when dealing with things like table views and table view controllers, where there are so many steps that we just did. Doing it over and over is the best thing. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. And I'll be on Slack to answer questions with your PMs as well.